For 80 years, it was a ghost story. 5 children vanished in a house fire, leaving nothing behind. The official report was a tragic accident, but the physics said otherwise. The fire was never hot enough. The bones were never there. What happens when a man of science, armed with data and DNA, sets out to debunk a local legend? What if he discovers that the ghost story was the only truth that mattered? The data was clear. The children didn't burn. They were taken. The hum of the servers was the only music Dr. Kaelen Reyes ever needed. It was a sound of order, of logic, a constant, steady thrum that promised everything was working as it should. His lab was a temple to this principle, a gleaming sanctuary of chrome, glass, and sterile white surfaces. Here, the chaotic mess of the world was rendered into clean, manageable data points. Emotion, intuition, belief, they had no place here. They couldn't be measured, quantified, or replicated. They were noise. He dealt in signal. Floating in the center of the room, a holographic skull turned slowly in the air, its bone-white surface mapped with a lattice of green light. This was John Doe #47, a man who had been a local ghost story for half a century, supposedly a victim of some spectral justice down by the old quarry. Kaelen had spent the last 3 months methodically stripping the legend away, layer by painstaking layer, until only the truth remained. With a flick of his wrist, he swiped a data slate across the air, pulling up the final mitochondrial DNA report on a secondary screen. The sequences scrolled past, a language he understood better than poetry. He cross-referenced it with a genealogical database, and a name finally populated the screen. A name, a history, a life. He traced the fine lines of a barely perceptible fracture above the orbital socket on the hologram, a detail the original 1970s coroner had missed entirely. His focus was absolute, a state of intellectual grace he could only find here, alone with the dead and the data they left behind. He leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing under his weight. He felt the familiar, satisfying click of a puzzle piece locking into place. The low, rumbling exhaustion in his bones was a good feeling. It was the feeling of a job done right, of a small piece of chaos being forced into the column of order. He looked at the skull, no longer a ghost, but a man. Cause of death, Kaelen murmured to the empty room, his voice a dry rasp. Blunt force trauma. Identity confirmed. He paused, taking a sip of cold coffee from a forgotten mug. Not a ghost story, just a murder. And to Kaelen Reyes, that was the most comforting thought in the world. There were no ghosts. There were only problems waiting for the right tool to solve them. The dean's office was the antithesis of his lab. It was designed to convey warmth and humanism, with its rich mahogany desk and abstract art. To Kaelen, it felt dishonest, a deliberate layer of artifice over the raw mechanics of university funding and departmental politics. Dean Miller, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, gestured for him to sit. Kaelen, another brilliant piece of work on the quarry case, the dean began, his voice smooth. The Historical Society is ecstatic. You have a real gift for tidying up the past. Kaelen gave a non-committal shrug. I just follow the evidence. Precisely, Miller said, sliding a digital tablet across the polished desk. Which is why I have a new project for you. More of a historical review, really. A formality for the archives. On the screen was a black and white photo of a burning house, stark against a winter sky. The title read, Sodder Case File, Historical Review. Kaelen's eyes scanned the synopsis below. Fayetteville, West Virginia. Christmas Eve, 1945. A family home burns to the ground. 5 children, missing. He felt the familiar, faint prickle of professional interest, the start of a new puzzle. But then he kept reading. His expression soured. The parents, George and Jenny Sodder, had maintained until their dying day that the children hadn't perished in the fire. They claimed they were kidnapped. kidnapped by the Sicilian mafia as retribution for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. They cited a cut phone line, a ladder that mysteriously vanished from its usual spot, a strange man seen watching the children from the roadside. They even claimed a premonition, a sense of dread that had haunted them for weeks. Kaelen let out a short, sharp scoff, a sound of pure, undiluted skepticism. He looked up at the Dean, his disdain barely concealed. "You can't be serious, Richard. This isn't a case. This is folklore." He pushed the tablet back across the desk as if it were contaminated. A tragic house fire interpreted through the lens of unimaginable grief. It's a textbook example of narrative construction to cope with trauma. They couldn't accept the simple, brutal reality, so they built a more elaborate one with villains and conspiracies. It gave them agency. It gave them hope. He stood up, already dismissing it, already walking back toward his world of clean data. No remains means a high-intensity blaze, fueled by old timber and a winter wind. Full combustion of juvenile bones. It's sad, but it's simple physics. It's not a mystery. Dean Miller held up a placating hand. Just review the file, Kaelen. Write a report confirming the original findings. Put the university's modern stamp on it. Close the book, officially. Kaelen paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "There's no book to close," he said without turning around. "Just an old sad story that people mistake for evidence." That night, the hum of the servers felt different. It was agitated, discordant. The Sodder file was a splinter in Kaelen's mind, an unsolved variable that disrupted the clean equations of his world. He had tried to ignore it, to move on to his next neatly packaged cold case, but the sheer, stubborn persistence of the parent's story gnawed at him. The narrative was messy, illogical, full of the human noise he so despised. And yet, he finally gave in, pulling the digitized 1945 case file onto his main screen. He would read it, debunk it point by point, and exercise it from his thoughts. He dissected the witness statements, the sheriff's report, the timeline of events. It was all as he expected, inconsistent, emotional, unreliable. Then he opened the fire marshal's official report, a single page, hastily written. The conclusion was based on an assumption. The fire, lasting no more than 45 minutes, had been hot enough to completely incinerate the bodies of 5 children, leaving nothing. Not a single tooth, not a single bone fragment. Kaelen frowned. An assumption is not data. He switched to another screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up architectural data for a typical 1940s timber frame house in rural West Virginia. He input the materials: pine siding, asphalt shingles, plaster and lathe walls. He fed in the meteorological data for Fayetteville on December 24, 1945. Temperature just above freezing, moderate winds from the northwest. He set the known duration of the blaze, approximately 45 minutes from ignition to collapse. Then he initiated a modern thermal combustion simulation. A wireframe model of the Sodder house appeared on screen, then became engulfed in digital flame. Thermometric charts scrolled past, calculating heat flux and material consumption. Kaelen leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, watching the numbers settle. The simulation concluded. The results flashed in the corner of the screen, a single stark line of text that made the air in the room go still. Simulation result: max sustained temperature, 1400 degrees. Kaelen's mind raced. He pulled up another data set, a forensic anthropology standard he knew by heart. Bone cremation threshold, complete, 2000 DF+, for minimum 2 hours. He stared at the 2 lines of text, side by side. They were incompatible. They were impossible. The official report, the entire foundation of the accident narrative for 80 years, was not just an assumption. It was scientifically, physically impossible. The hum of the servers seemed to mock him. The story was supposed to be simple, tragic but simple. But the physics, his physics, said otherwise. The fire wasn't hot enough, not even close. There should have been remains. There should have been skeletons. He looked at the crime scene photos again, at the placid, undisturbed snow around the smoking basement. For the first time in his professional life, Dr. Kaelen Reyes was confronted with a ghost in his machine, a variable that his science could not explain away, but had instead unearthed. The story wasn't closed. It had just been opened, and the cold, hard data was telling him that maybe, just maybe, the folklore was right. The drive from the city was like a journey back in time. With every mile that spooled out behind him, the sleek, ordered world of highways and modern architecture dissolved, replaced by winding country roads and dense, ancient forests. Kaelen's rental car, a sterile capsule of quiet efficiency and brushed aluminum, felt like a visiting spaceship navigating a foreign planet. When he finally rolled into Fayetteville, West Virginia, the feeling intensified. The town seemed to be holding its breath, preserved in the amber of a bygone era. The storefronts on the main street had faded painted signs, the brickwork was weathered and worn, and the town square was dominated by a solemn, grey stone courthouse that had seen more history than Kaelen could imagine. There was a palpable weight to the air, a sense of deep roots and long memories. It was the complete opposite of his lab, where the only history that mattered was the data he could pull from a bone fragment. Here, history was a living thing, a collective consciousness that watched him from behind curtained windows. He was an outsider, an intruder with his modern tools and his disruptive questions, and the town seemed to know it. The sheriff's office was exactly as Kaelen had pictured it. Not a single holographic display or touchscreen in sight. Instead, there were towers of paper, overflowing filing cabinets, and a thick, lingering smell of brewed coffee and dust. Sheriff Brody Evans fit the room perfectly. He was a man in his 50s, with a face etched by pragmatism and a deep-seated weariness that came from dealing with the predictable troubles of a small town. He leaned back in a creaking chair, his hands clasped behind his head, and regarded Kaelen with an expression that was 1 part politeness and 9 parts profound skepticism. "Dr. Reyes," Evans said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "I got your email. Can't say I understand why a man with your credentials wants to come all the way out here to dig up a ghost." "I'm not digging up ghosts, Sheriff," Kaelen replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm reviewing the physical evidence. My analysis of the original fire marshal's report shows a significant scientific discrepancy." Evans let out a slow sigh, the sound of a man who had heard it all before. "Discrepancy, right. Look, my grandfather knew the Sodders, my father knew the stories. I know the stories. That case was settled before I was born. It was a tragedy, a horrible, awful tragedy. Trying to turn it into a conspiracy, a big mystery, that doesn't help anyone. It just picks at a wound that this town has spent the better part of a century trying to heal." He gestured vaguely at the stacks of paper around him. "I've got real problems, Doctor. Living ones. I don't have time to go chasing shadows for you." Kaelen recognized the attitude. It was the voice of institutional inertia, the comfort of a story that, true or not, had been accepted. "The physics don't support the story, Sheriff. That's a real problem for me." Evans just shook his head slowly. "You city folks and your physics. Out here, sometimes a tragedy is just a tragedy." The historical marker was a simple bronze plaque on a stone plinth, set in a small, well-tended patch of grass just off the main road. It marked the spot where the Sodder home had once stood. The land behind it was an empty field, a green and tranquil scar. Kaelen read the inscription, a brief, dispassionate account of the fire on Christmas Eve 1945, and the 5 children who were lost in the blaze. Lost. A passive, gentle word for such a violent, contested end. They used that word to be kind. Kaelen turned. A woman stood beside him, her presence as quiet and steady as the stone marker. She was in her 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a deep, inherited sorrow. This was Lara Vance. "They called my great-aunt Jenny crazy," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of self-pity. "Her and my great-uncle George. They spent every dollar they had, their whole lives, trying to get someone to listen. But to everyone else, they were just the poor, grieving Sodders who couldn't accept the truth." She looked at Kaelen, her gaze direct and piercing. But she knew it wasn't a truth you find in a report. It was a truth a mother feels in her soul. You can't burn 5 children into nothing, not in that fire, not in that house. She seemed to understand his skepticism before he could even voice it. The real truth isn't in the official papers, she continued, her voice dropping slightly. It's in the things they ignored. She held out a small, wooden box, its surface worn smooth with time. These were my great-aunts. Letters she wrote, clippings she saved, notes she made, the things nobody else wanted to see. Kaelen took the box. It felt heavier than it should. This was the other side of the equation. Not data, not physics, but belief. A narrative built from intuition, experience, and a stubborn refusal to accept a reality that felt wrong. It was everything he was trained to dismiss, and yet, standing on this empty ground, he couldn't. His science had brought him here, but it had brought him to her doorstep. The day of the scan was overcast and grey, the sky a muted, oppressive lid over the quiet field. Kaelen's team, a pair of graduate students he'd brought with him, moved with quiet efficiency, setting up the ground-penetrating radar. The machine looked alien here, a piece of advanced technology plopped down in the middle of a ghost story. It was a strange, almost sacred ritual. The methodical unwinding of cables, the calibration of sensors, the plotting of the grid that would cover every square inch of the former house. From a distance, 2 figures watched. Ilara Vance stood by an old oak tree, her hands clasped in front of her, a silent, hopeful vigil. She had been waiting her entire life for this day, for a machine that could finally see what she had always known was not there. On the other side of the field, leaning against the hood of his patrol car, was Sheriff Evans. His arms were crossed, his face a mask of cynical resignation, waiting for the inevitable moment when this expensive charade would be over and he could tell the scientist, "I told you so." They were the 2 poles of the story, belief and skepticism, the family and the institution, the heart and the law. And Kaelen was in the middle, his machine the arbiter that would either validate a family's deepest truth or reaffirm a town's official history. The scan began. One of the students pushed the GPR unit slowly, deliberately, along the first line of the grid. On a tablet in Kaelen's hands, lines of data began to scroll, a cross-section of the world beneath his feet. Soil, rocks, roots, the faint outline of the old coal cellar. The work was slow, meticulous, agonizingly so. Every pass of the machine was a question asked of the earth itself. The air was thick with the unspoken weight of it. 80 years of mystery, of grief, of stubborn hope and cynical dismissal were all focused on the silent, humming machine and the lines of code appearing on Kaelen's screen. He kept his face impassive, his eyes locked on the data, betraying nothing, as the ghosts of the past were finally, scientifically, put to the test. The motel room was suffocatingly quiet, a stark contrast to the storm of data processing inside Kaelen's laptop. The air was stale, with the smell of old carpets and disinfectant, 1,000 miles away from the clean, controlled atmosphere of his lab. He stared at the screen, his coffee long forgotten, as the final GPR data rendered into a series of stark, color-coded cross-sections of the Earth. He scrolled through them, one by one, each swipe of his finger a descent into 80 years of buried history. The screen showed the distinct lines of soil stratigraphy, the compacted earth of the old driveway, the rubble-filled outline of the collapsed foundations, and then nothing. Just undisturbed soil where the heart of the house, the living spaces, would have been. He zoomed in, running filters to highlight organic compounds and bone density anomalies. The screen remained stubbornly, impossibly clean. There were no bone fragments, no calcified dental remains. There were no clusters of concentrated carbon that would indicate human ash. He ran the diagnostic again, then a third time, searching for an error in his methodology. a flaw in the machine's calibration. But the results were as definitive as a DNA test. The science was absolute. His thermal simulation had been correct. The children were not in that fire. He leaned back, the cheap chair groaning in protest, and ran a hand over his face. The foundation of the official story, the one Sheriff Evans and the town had clung to for decades, wasn't just cracked. It had been vaporized. Kaelen's own rigorous, dispassionate science had just validated the core premise of the family's superstitious belief. The irrational narrative was now the only one that made any logical sense. The next morning, the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight of the town archives felt like tiny, floating ghosts of the past. Spurred by the GPR results, Kaelen now saw the box of letters Ilara had given him not as a collection of grief-stricken ramblings, but as a potential roadmap. With Ilara at his side, her finger tracing the faded cursive of her great-aunt's handwriting, they began to dig. "Here," Ilara said, pointing to a passage in a letter from 1946. George was getting threats. He was very outspoken, very anti-Mussolini. It made some people in the Italian community angry, people with connections. Guided by the names and dates in the letters, they cross-referenced the town's public records. It was slow, painstaking work, but a pattern began to emerge from the yellowed pages. Property disputes where George Sodder had refused to be intimidated. Records of business dealings with men whose names were whispered in connection with organized crime from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. The folklore was growing a skeleton of documented fact. Then, Kaelen found it. Buried deep in a microfiche of old police logs, a single entry from Christmas Eve, 1945. A local resident reported a strange car parked on the road overlooking the Sodder property just hours before the fire. The report was marked with a handwritten note from the sheriff at the time. No follow-up, probably late travelers. It had been dismissed, ignored, just like the family. The line between their private grief and public record was blurring, revealing not a simple tragedy, but the shadow of a conspiracy. Their meeting with Silas Crow took place in the town's only diner, a place of red vinyl booths and thick ceramic mugs. Crow, the town's esteemed historian and curator, had the polished charm of a man accustomed to being the sole authority on the past. He listened to Kaelen's summary of the GPR results and the archive findings with a patient, paternalistic smile. When Kaelen finished, Crow took a slow sip of his coffee. "Fascinating," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "Truly, it's a testament to your skill, Doctor." He set the mug down gently. "But you must understand, stories like this have a life of their own in Appalachia. The mafia theory. It's a compelling story, but it's just that, a story. A way for a community to process something too terrible to comprehend." He looked from Kaelen to Ilara, his eyes soft with what looked like sympathy, but felt like condescension. People in this part of the country have always seen conspiracies behind every tragedy. The truth is usually simpler and much, much sadder. He skillfully steered the conversation away, talking about the challenges of historical preservation, of separating fact from folklore. He was an expert gatekeeper, framing their evidence as an interesting but romantic fantasy. Kaelen watched him, a cold realization dawning. Crow wasn't just a historian preserving the official narrative. He was actively defending it. Frustration was a bitter acid in Kaelen's throat. Back in the stale air of his motel room that night, Silas Crow's dismissive smile was burned into his mind. He had been so sure the data would be irrefutable. But data was useless if the person you showed it to refused to see it. He paced the small room, a caged animal. His science had hit a wall of curated belief. His eyes fell on the wooden box Ilara had given him, sitting on the cheap dresser. He'd been through the letters, but he hadn't examined every single item. He dumped the contents onto the bed. Old newspaper clippings, a child's drawing, a rosary, and at the bottom, a photograph in a faded paper sleeve. He pulled it out. It was the infamous picture mailed to the family in the 1960s. A black and white image of a young man in his early 20s, with dark, wavy hair and features that were hauntingly similar to photos of the eldest Sodder son, Lewis. Kaelen had read about it in the case file and, like everyone else, had dismissed it as a cruel and twisted prank. It was law. It was noise. But as he stared at it now, under the dim motel lamp, something had shifted in him. Crow had challenged him to stick to what he could measure. And a photograph, Kaelen realized, was just a collection of data points. Driven by a surge of defiant energy, he placed the photo on a flat surface and captured it with his phone's high-resolution scanner. He uploaded the image to his laptop, running it through a forensic enhancement suite to sharpen the focus and clarify the grain. Then, he fed the enhanced image into the most sophisticated facial recognition software he had access to, a program that cross-referenced global databases from the FBI, Interpol, and other law enforcement agencies. He initiated the search, linking it to known associates of the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh crime families from the mid-20th century. The progress bar on the screen filled with agonizing slowness. He waited, his heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He was applying the pinnacle of a modern forensic technology to a piece of evidence that every rational authority had dismissed as a fantasy. He was chasing a ghost with a supercomputer. The search completed. A box appeared on the screen. Partial match found. His blood ran cold. He clicked open the file. On one side was the man from the photograph. On the other, a grainy surveillance photo of a recently deceased associate of a Philadelphia crime family. Below them, the statistical analysis scrolled. Factoring for age progression and image quality, the software calculated a 78% probability that they were the same person. Kaelen stared, unable to breathe. The world didn't just shift, it cracked wide open. The photograph wasn't a prank. The folklore wasn't folklore. It was a lead. A piece of family lore had just become his single most important piece of forensic data. The investigation wasn't about a fire anymore. It was about a conspiracy, a cover-up, and a life that had been stolen and hidden for decades. Everything had just changed. The 78% probability felt like a brand on Kaelen's brain. It was a number that had rewired his entire understanding of the case, transforming it from a historical puzzle into a living, breathing conspiracy. The name from the database, a low-level enforcer for a Philadelphia crime family, deceased for 6 years, was his new pole star. He left Fayetteville before dawn, the empty roads of West Virginia slick with a fine morning mist. He was driving toward the county where the man had lived out his final years, chasing the ghost that his computer had found. He was 20 miles out when he first noticed it. A dark, old sedan, American-made, heavy, the kind of car that absorbs light. It was keeping a steady distance, 2 car lengths back. Kaelen, a creature of pattern recognition, tried to dismiss it. It was a public road. It was a coincidence. But when he took a series of turns onto smaller, less-traveled back roads, the sedan followed without hesitation. The scientist in him calculated probabilities. The nascent realist he was becoming felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. He pulled over onto a gravel shoulder, feigning engine trouble. He popped the hood, a meaningless gesture, and watched in his side mirror. The sedan slowed. Then, instead of passing, it executed a swift, silent U-turn and vanished back the way it came. There was no coincidence. It was a message. He was being watched. When he finally reached the small town and parked outside the county records office, his sense of unease was a physical presence. After an hour of fruitless searching, the man had lived a quiet, almost invisible life. Kaelen returned to his car. The driver's side door was not as he had left it. It was slightly ajar, maybe by half an inch. He scanned the interior. Nothing was missing. His laptop was there, his equipment untouched. But the message was louder this time, a visceral violation. We can get to you. We can touch your world whenever we want. The rational scientist, the man who lived by empirical evidence, was now living in the center of a conspiracy theorist's nightmare, and the evidence was all around him. He found Silas Crowe holding court outside the local history museum, charming a small tour group with anecdotes about the town's founding fathers. Kaelen waited until the group dispersed, then approached, his face set like stone. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know the name of the crime family," Kaelen said, his voice low and even. He stated the name, the one from the database, and watched as Crowe's carefully constructed mask of scholarly charm didn't just crack, it fractured. For a split second, a flicker of cold, reptilian fury showed in the old man's eyes, before being instantly suppressed, smoothed over by his practiced smile. But Kaelen had seen it. Crowe took a step closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing whisper. "Some sleeping dog should be left to lie, Doctor. A man like you should appreciate that. History has a way of protecting itself, of burying the things that need to be buried." He placed a hand on Kaelen's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem paternal, but felt like a manacle. "You're a scientist. A brilliant one, from what I hear. Stick to what you can measure. Analyze your soil samples. Date your artifacts. Don't go chasing ghosts." He squeezed Kaelen's shoulder, a final, emphatic punctuation. "The ghosts in these hills are real, Doctor, and they don't like being disturbed." The threat, no longer veiled, hung in the air between them. Crowe had just confirmed everything. He wasn't just a gatekeeper of history, he was a guardian of its darkest secrets. Kaelen drove away from the museum with a cold, terrifying clarity. Official channels were useless. The local sheriff saw him as a nuisance. The town's most powerful figure was actively working against him, threatening him. The rules of scientific inquiry, of methodical, transparent investigation, no longer applied. To operate by those rules now would be to fail, or worse. The conspiracy was real, and to fight it, he would have to step into its shadowy world. The lead from the database had given him more than just the name of the deceased mafia associate. It had given him the names of his surviving family. A single descendant, an elderly man, the son of the man in the photograph, now living in a long-term care facility in a neighboring state. A DNA sample from him would be the final, irrefutable link, the key that could unlock the entire 80-year-old mystery. But there was no legal way to get it. He found the man in the hospital's bleak cafeteria, sitting alone by a window, staring out at a grey sky. He was frail, lost in the private world of old age and infirmity. Kaelen watched him from across the room, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. His entire career had been built on a foundation of rigid ethics, of procedural purity. He was an objective observer of evidence, never a participant in its creation. Now he was about to shatter that foundation. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He walked to the counter and bought a coffee he didn't want. He approached the old man's table, adopting the air of a friendly hospital researcher. He made small talk, asking about the weather, the food, his clinical charts visible on a tablet he carried. The old man barely seemed to register his presence, offering only a few mumbled replies. After a few minutes, the man's coffee was finished. Kaelen saw his chance. "Here, let me get that for you," he said, his voice sounding foreign and false to his own ears. He picked up the disposable paper cup, his fingers carefully touching only the bottom. As he turned away from the table, his other hand slipped a sterile evidence bag from his pocket. In one swift, fluid motion, hidden by the angle of his body, he dropped the cup into the bag and sealed it. He disposed of his own coffee in the trash and walked out of the cafeteria, the bagged cup a hot, shameful weight in his coat pocket. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a spy, a thief. He had compromised his ethics, violated a stranger's privacy, and abandoned the very principles he held sacred. But as he walked out into the cold afternoon air, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was the only way to find the truth. The sealed evidence bag containing the coffee cup had sat on the motel room dresser for 48 hours, a monument to Kaelen's ethical transgression. He had overnighted a swab to a trusted colleague at a private lab, a friend who owed him a favor and knew how to keep a secret. Now, all he could do was wait. He hadn't slept. He had just sat, staring at the bag, the scientist in him warring with the man who had committed a crime, however small, to serve a greater truth. A soft chime from his laptop cut through the silence. The email was here. The subject line was blank. The body contained only a single encrypted data file. His hands, usually so steady during the most delicate forensic procedures, trembled slightly as he keyed in the decryption password. The file opened, revealing a raw genetic sequence, the sample from the cup. From his own archives, he pulled up the file he'd created weeks ago, a sequence he had painstakingly extracted from the dried saliva on the flap of an envelope from a letter Jenny Sodder had written in 1952, a letter from the box Elara had given him. He initiated the familial DNA comparison, a program that would search for the unique mitochondrial markers passed down from a mother to her children. The process took less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds to unravel 80 years of lies. A small window popped up on the screen, the text simple, black and white, and utterly monumental. Maternal lineage match confirmed. Kaelen stopped breathing. He ran the test again. The result was the same. The science was irrefutable. The elderly man in the hospital was the biological son of Jenny Sodder, which meant the man in the cryptic 1960s photograph, the mafia enforcer, was Louis Sodder, the boy who was supposed to have burned to ash on Christmas Eve. A wave of profound, soul-shaking vindication washed over him, followed immediately by a deep, aching sadness. He had it. The proof. The signal in the noise. The truth that George and Jenny Sodder had died screaming for, that Elara Vance had carried in her heart, was now here, quantified and undeniable on his laptop screen. The family's superstitious lore, the photograph they'd clung to like a holy relic, had been the absolute truth all along. The private office of the History Museum was Silas Crow's inner sanctum, filled with antique maps and leather-bound books that smelled of dust and authority. Kaelen entered without knocking and locked the door behind him. Crow looked up from his desk, his charming smile faltering as he saw the look in Kaelen's eyes. This was not the frustrated academic he had dismissed days ago. This was someone else entirely. Kaelen didn't raise his voice. He walked to the wide, polished antique desk and began to lay out his evidence, piece by piece, like a man dealing a final winning hand in a game of cards. First, he placed down a printout of his thermal simulation. "The fire was never hot enough," he said calmly. Next, he laid down the GPR scan results, a series of images showing nothing but undisturbed Earth. There were no bodies. He followed it with the pages from the town archives, highlighting the names of the organized crime figures connected to George Sodder. There was a motive. Then came the enhanced photograph of the young man, his face clear and hauntingly familiar. And there was a witness, a victim, who sent a message. Finally, he placed the last piece of paper on the desk, the DNA report. He tapped the conclusion with his index finger. And now there is proof. Crow stared at the paper, his face ashen. The folksy charm, the intellectual condescension, the veiled threats. It all evaporated, leaving behind only a tired, defeated old man. Kaelen watched him, the puzzle pieces clicking into their final, terrible alignment. Crow's family had been the law in this town for generations. His grandfather was the sheriff who had dismissed the report of the strange car. His father was the fire marshal who had signed the impossible report. "You're the gatekeeper because your family built the gate," Kaelen said, the accusation quiet, but absolute. "You've spent your life curating a history that covered up a crime, a kidnapping your ancestors didn't just ignore, they facilitated it." Crow slumped in his chair, the weight of 80 years crushing him. He looked at Kaelen, his eyes hollow. "It wasn't supposed to be a murder," he whispered, the words brittle as old paper. "It was business. Sodder wouldn't play ball. He was a problem. They just wanted him silenced, his family broken. It was never about killing them. It was just a removal." The word hung in the air, obscene in its simplicity. A removal. Not 5 children, not 5 lives. A problem to be erased, the evidence burned, and the truth buried under decades of official lies that he was tasked to protect. Dawn was breaking over the West Virginia hills, painting the sky in soft shades of grey and rose. Kaelen stood with Alara Vance at the historical marker, the air crisp and cold. He handed her a folder containing his official report. The GPR scans, the DNA results, Crow's confession, the entire validated truth. She took it, her hands trembling as she clutched it to her chest. She looked out over the empty, tranquil field where her family had been torn apart. Tears streamed down her face, tears of vindication and of sorrow for a justice that had arrived a lifetime too late. "You proved it," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "After all this time, you finally proved they were telling the truth." Kaelen watched the sunrise, the first rays of light touching the bronze plaque. The arrogant certainty he had arrived with was gone, burned away, and replaced by a deep, weary wisdom. He was no longer the man who believed science was the source of truth, but the man who knew it was merely one of its languages. "No, Alara," he replied, turning to her, his own eyes tired but clear. "Your family knew the truth all along. They felt it. They lived it. I just found a way to translate it." What an incredible story. On the surface, it's a gripping cold case, a mystery 80 years in the making. But underneath, it's asking something much deeper about how we define truth. We meet Dr. Reyes, a man who lives in a world of clean data, where anything that can't be measured is simply noise. On the other side, we have the Sodder family, clinging to a belief that everyone else calls folklore. A conviction born from intuition, and a mother's gut feeling. The genius of this narrative is how it forces these two worlds to collide. We expect the scientist to arrive and calmly debunk the local legend with facts and figures. But instead, every tool he uses, thermal dynamics, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, does the opposite. His science doesn't disprove the family's belief, it proves it. It suggests that truth isn't always discovered in a lab. Sometimes, it's known long before, felt in a way that defies explanation. Kaelen's journey wasn't about discovering the truth, but about learning to translate a truth that was already there. Jenny Sodder didn't need a DNA report to know her child was alive. Kaelen's science just gave that certainty, a voice the world could finally understand. So, here's my question for you. Which is more powerful? A truth you can prove with data, or a truth you feel in your soul, even if no one else believes you?